The autumn sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Sweet Bean Café, a cozy spot that had been serving the downtown community for over 2 decades. Among the morning rush of customers stood a young black woman, a respected pediatrician who had recently moved to the area. She waited patiently in line, reviewing patient files on her tablet while the aroma of freshly ground coffee filled the air. The cafe was bustling with its usual mix of business professionals, college students, and local residents. The young doctor had quickly made this her regular morning stop, drawn to both the quality of their coffee and the warm atmosphere. Today, however, would prove different from her usual peaceful morning routine. As she reached the front of the line, a new security guard stationed near the counter began watching her intently. The guard, a middle-aged man with graying temples who had only been working there for a week, stepped closer, his demeanor unnecessarily stern. Other customers continued their conversations, initially oblivious to what was about to unfold. "Excuse me," the guard said loudly, causing several heads to turn. "I need to see what's in your bag." His tone was harsh, cutting through the ambient chatter of the cafe. The doctor, taken aback, noticed that no other customers had been subjected to such treatment that morning. "I'm a regular customer here," she responded calmly, though her heart raced. "I come here every morning before heading to the children's hospital." She gestured to her medical ID badge, clearly visible on her lab coat. The guard's face hardened. "That doesn't matter. We've had some incidents recently." His eyes narrowed as he glanced meaningfully at her designer handbag. "Need to make sure everything's legitimate here." The cafe fell quieter as more customers began to notice the confrontation. Behind the counter, the baristas exchanged worried glances, unsure how to intervene. One of them, a young college student who recognized the doctor as a regular, began fidgeting nervously with the coffee cups. An elderly woman sitting nearby slowly lowered her newspaper, her eyes widening as she observed the scene. She had been coming to this cafe for years and had never witnessed such treatment of any customer. The doctor stood her ground, maintaining her composure despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Sir," she said, her voice steady but firm, "I understand you're doing your job, but I've been coming here every day for the past 6 months. I'm a pediatrician at Memorial Children's Hospital. Would you like to see my medical license as well?" The sarcasm in her last question was subtle but clear. The guard's response was immediate and loud. "Look, if you don't have anything to hide, you shouldn't have a problem showing me your bag. Rules are rules." His voice carried across the cafe, drawing more attention to the situation. A young man in a business suit, who had been watching the scene unfold while waiting for his order, stepped forward. "Hey, I've been coming here for years, and I've never seen anyone's bag searched. What's really going on here?" Other customers began to murmur in agreement. An older gentleman who had been quietly sipping his coffee stood up, his face etched with concern. "I was a store manager for 40 years, he announced. "This kind of selective enforcement isn't security, it's harassment." The cafe owner, alerted by one of the baristas, emerged from the back office. She was a small woman with kind eyes and graying hair, but her expression was fierce as she took in the scene. She had built this cafe on principles of community and inclusivity, and what she was witnessing went against everything she stood for. As she approached, more customers began to speak up. A group of college students pulled out their phones, ready to document any escalation. The tension in the air was palpable, but so was the sense of solidarity building among the customers. The doctor, still standing tall despite the humiliation, looked the guard directly in the eyes. "I don't need to prove anything to you," she said quietly. "But you've just proved something to everyone here." A teacher from the local high school, who had been grading papers in the corner, stood up and walked to the counter. "I'll have what she's having," she announced loudly, "and I'm paying for her order too." This simple act of solidarity sparked a chain reaction. The cafe owner finally reached the counter, her face set with determination. She had seen enough. The story was far from over, but this moment would mark a turning point not just for the Sweet Bean Café, but for the entire community. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air and highlighting the faces of everyone present, faces that showed a mix of emotions: anger, empathy, determination, and hope. What started as a routine morning was about to become a catalyst for change in their small corner of the world. The cafe owner's voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "In my establishment, we treat everyone with respect," she declared, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years of community building. "Guard, you're dismissed. Please leave the premises immediately." The guard's face reddened. "But ma'am, I was just following." "Following what?" the owner interrupted, her eyes flashing. "Because it certainly wasn't our protocols. We've never had a policy of searching customers' bags, and we never will." She turned to the doctor, her expression softening. "I am so deeply sorry for what just happened. Your coffee is on the house today, and every day this week." The young doctor shook her head gently. "I appreciate that, but free coffee isn't the solution here." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the counter. "What happened today isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever felt unwelcome or unsafe in spaces where they have every right to be." The crowd of customers had grown larger, with even those who had been waiting outside now packed into the cafe. The morning sun caught the steam rising from forgotten coffee cups as people remained transfixed by the unfolding scene. A middle-aged woman stepped forward from the crowd. She worked at the Diversity and Inclusion office at the local university, though no one knew that yet. "I've seen this too many times," she said, her voice carrying years of experience. "But what's different here is how everyone responded. Look around, this is what community looks like." The guard, still standing awkwardly by the counter, seemed to shrink under the collective gaze of the customers. The owner turned back to him, her voice firm but not unkind. "Please leave your badge at the office. The security company will be hearing from me about this incident." As the guard made his way toward the back office, an elderly man who had been quietly observing spoke up. "You know, I've lived in this neighborhood for 60 years. I've seen how things have changed, some for better, some for worse. But what hasn't changed is our responsibility to stand up for what's right." The doctor took a deep breath, looking around at the faces of support surrounding her. She saw the young barista who had tried to signal his discomfort, the businessman who had first spoken up, the teacher who had offered to pay for her coffee, and dozens of others who had witnessed and refused to remain silent. "I could leave," she said, her voice clear and composed. "I could find another cafe, another morning routine. That's what many people do when faced with situations like this. But that doesn't solve anything." She paused, making eye contact with several people in the crowd. "Instead, I'd like to propose something different." The cafe owner stepped closer, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "This cafe has been a community hub for decades," the doctor continued. "Why not use this moment to make it even more so? To create something positive from this experience?" A young graphic designer who had been live streaming the incident on her phone spoke up. "The video's already getting attention online. People are asking how they can help, how they can show support." The university employee nodded thoughtfully. "What if we organized regular community dialogues here? Create a space where people can share their experiences, learn from each other, and work together to prevent incidents like this?" The cafe owner's eyes lit up. "We could do more than that. This cafe has always been about bringing people together. We could establish a training program for local businesses, share best practices, create real change in our community." As the conversation continued, more ideas began flowing. A local business owner offered to help develop anti-bias training materials. A retired teacher volunteered to facilitate discussion groups. The college students started planning social media campaigns to spread awareness. The young doctor watched as this spontaneous community meeting unfolded, her earlier humiliation gradually being replaced by a sense of cautious hope. She hadn't asked for this role, hadn't wanted to become the catalyst for change, but now that it was happening, she felt a responsibility to help guide it. Change doesn't happen overnight, she said, addressing the crowd once more. But it does happen when people come together like this, when they refuse to accept discrimination as normal, when they're willing to have uncomfortable conversations and do the hard work of creating something better. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, and many of the customers were now late for work or other appointments. But nobody seemed to mind. Business cards were being exchanged, phone numbers shared, and plans made for future meetings. The cafe owner, watching all of this unfold in her beloved establishment, felt a mix of emotions: sadness that such an incident had occurred in her cafe, but pride in how her community had responded. She picked up a marker and walked to the large chalkboard where the day's specials were usually written. In clear, bold letters, she wrote, "The Sweet Bean Cafe Community Forum, everyone welcome, everyone respected." Below it, she began listing dates and times for the first community dialogue session. As people began reluctantly dispersing to their daily responsibilities, there was a sense that something significant had shifted in their community. The incident that had begun as an act of discrimination had transformed into a catalyst for connection, conversation, and change. The young doctor finally received her coffee, now long cold, but she hardly noticed. She had come in that morning as just another customer, but she was leaving as part of something much larger, a movement born from confrontation but fueled by hope and solidarity. Word of what happened at the Sweet Bean Cafe spread through the community like wildfire. By afternoon, the video had gone viral on social media, drawing attention from local news outlets and civil rights organizations. But unlike many viral incidents that fade into digital obscurity, this one was already sparking real change in the community. The young doctor arrived at work that morning to find her email inbox flooded with messages of support. Her colleagues at the Children's Hospital, upon hearing what happened, organized an impromptu meeting during lunch break. The hospital's administrative board, concerned about similar incidents in their own facility, reached out to discuss reviewing their security protocols. Back at the cafe, the owner spent the day fielding calls from other local business owners. The incident had forced many to confront an uncomfortable truth, that discrimination could happen anywhere, even in establishments that prided themselves on being welcoming spaces. By mid-afternoon, she had scheduled meetings with 5 other cafe owners in the area to discuss implementing better training programs. The security company that had employed the guard issued a public apology, but the community demanded more than just words. The university employee who had spoken up during the incident received permission from her department to develop a comprehensive training program. Local business owners would send their staff through this program, ensuring that what happened at Sweet Bean Cafe wouldn't be repeated elsewhere. As evening approached, the cafe hosted its first impromptu community meeting. The tables were pushed together to form a large circle, and people from all walks of life filtered in. There was the elderly man who had lived in the neighborhood for 60 years, sitting next to college students who had only been there for a semester. The local business owners came straight from work, still in their suits and uniforms. The young doctor arrived last, having completed her shift at the hospital. The room fell quiet as she entered, but she quickly waved off any special attention. "I'm just here to listen and contribute, like everyone else," she said, taking a seat between a high school teacher and a grocery store manager. The cafe owner had prepared coffee and pastries for everyone, and the atmosphere was purposefully kept informal. "This isn't about pointing fingers," she began, "it's about making sure our community lives up to its potential. We all have blind spots, but we also all have the power to do better." A local shop owner raised his hand. "I've been thinking all day about my own business," he admitted. "How many times have I failed to notice when my customers felt uncomfortable or unwelcome? How many times have my employees needed better guidance?" The university employee nodded. That's exactly why we're here. Change starts with awareness, but it doesn't end there. We need concrete actions, measurable goals, and most importantly, accountability. For the next 2 hours, the group discussed practical steps. The graphic designer who had recorded the incident presented a draft of a community charter, outlining principles of inclusion and respect that businesses could publicly commit to. A local printer offered to create window decals for participating establishments. The high school teacher suggested involving students in the initiative. My students are always looking for meaningful community service projects, she explained. They could help audit businesses, create training materials, and spread awareness on social media. As the meeting progressed, the conversation shifted from the specific incident to broader community issues. People began sharing their own experiences, stories that had gone untold for years. The elderly man spoke about changes he'd witnessed over decades. A young mother described her fears about raising children in a world where discrimination still existed. The doctor listened intently to each story, occasionally offering her own insights. When she finally spoke at length, her words carried the weight of both personal experience and professional observation. In my work at the hospital, I see how stress and trauma affect people's health, she explained. What happened to me today, that kind of experience leaves marks that aren't visible. But what I'm seeing in this room right now, this commitment to change, this willingness to listen and learn, that's the medicine our community needs. The grocery store manager raised an interesting point about customer service training. We spend so much time teaching employees about product knowledge and sales techniques, he said. But how much time do we spend teaching them about human dignity and respect? As the meeting drew to a close, concrete plans had emerged. The university would host monthly training sessions. Local businesses would implement new policies and procedures. The cafe would serve as a regular meeting space for ongoing discussions and progress reviews. The young doctor volunteered to share her medical perspective on the impact of discrimination on community health. Others offered their professional expertise, legal advice, marketing skills, educational resources. What had started as a response to one incident was evolving into a comprehensive community initiative. Before everyone left, the cafe owner unveiled a new addition to her wall, a large community board where people could post resources, upcoming events, and success stories. The first item posted was the date for the next meeting, 1 week away. As people began gathering their things to leave, the elderly man who had witnessed the morning's events stood up. You know, he said, his voice slightly shaky with emotion, I've seen a lot of promises of change over the years. But this feels different. This feels real. The doctor gathered her bag, now freely and proudly carried without fear of questioning. As she headed toward the door, several people stopped to thank her, not for being a victim, but for being a catalyst for change. She smiled, knowing that tomorrow morning she would return for her regular coffee, stronger and more connected to her community than ever before. Outside, the evening sky had turned a deep purple, and the cafe's warm lights spilled onto the sidewalk. People lingered in small groups, exchanging contact information and continuing discussions. What had begun as one of the worst mornings at Sweet Bean Café had transformed into one of its most promising evenings, a testament to the power of community response to injustice. 1 week after the incident, the Sweet Bean Café had transformed. The community board was now filled with colorful flyers and sign-up sheets. Local businesses had begun displaying the newly designed Community United window decals, and the first official training session was scheduled for the following weekend. But change rarely comes without resistance. The morning regulars noticed a slight dip in elderly customers, some of whom felt uncomfortable with all the attention the cafe was receiving. A few online reviews criticized the owner for making everything political. The security company, while publicly apologetic, had quietly suggested that their services might be better suited for other establishments. The young doctor noticed these subtle shifts during her morning visits. She saw how the cafe owner's smile sometimes carried a hint of worry, how some customers would hesitate at the door before entering. Real change, she realized, wasn't just about grand gestures and public statements, it was about navigating the small, daily challenges that came with standing up for what's right. One morning, an elderly customer who had stopped coming in after the incident returned. She approached the counter slowly, leaning on her cane. "I've been going to the coffee shop 3 blocks over," she admitted to the owner. "But their coffee isn't as good, and I miss this place. I wasn't sure if it was still for people like me anymore." The cafe owner poured the elderly woman's usual order, chamomile tea with a splash of honey, and pulled up a chair to sit with her. Their conversation, though quiet, drew the attention of other customers. The elderly woman spoke of her fears about change, while the owner listened patiently. By the end of their talk, both were wiping away tears, and the elderly woman had signed up to share her stories at the next community meeting. The university's training program was taking shape, led by the diversity and inclusion officer who had spoken up that first day. She worked late into the nights, developing materials that went beyond simple do's and don'ts. "We're not just teaching people what not to do," she explained during a planning session. "We're helping them understand why these issues matter, how bias affects everyone, and what genuine inclusion looks like in practice." The high school students had taken up the cause with particular enthusiasm. Under their teachers' guidance, they created a documentary project, interviewing local business owners and community members about their experiences with discrimination and their hopes for change. Their young voices brought fresh energy and perspective to the movement. The local business community's response had been mixed. Some embraced the initiative wholeheartedly, eager to learn and improve. Others participated reluctantly, motivated more by public relations concerns than genuine conviction. A few refused to participate at all, claiming the whole thing was unnecessary. One morning, about 10 days after the incident, the doctor arrived at the cafe to find an unexpected face behind the counter, the owner's elderly mother. The old woman had taken the bus from 2 towns over after seeing her daughter on the local news. "I raised her in this business," the mother told customers proudly. "Back when we first opened, people told us this neighborhood wouldn't support a cafe like this. But my daughter always said that good coffee and respect for people would bring the community together. Look how right she was." The mother's presence added another layer to the story. She shared tales of the neighborhood's history, of other moments when the community had faced challenges and come together. Her stories reminded everyone that what they were doing wasn't new, it was part of a long tradition of community members standing up for each other. The doctor's hospital had taken steps of its own. The administration implemented new training protocols for all staff, including security personnel. They created a patient advocacy program, ensuring that everyone who walked through their doors felt safe and respected. Other healthcare facilities in the area began reaching out, asking for guidance on implementing similar changes. The local media continued to follow the story, but their focus shifted from the initial incident to the community's response. A reporter from the city paper spent a full day at the cafe, observing the subtle ways things had changed. She noted how customers from different backgrounds now greeted each other by name, how business meetings and study groups had become more diverse, how the cafe had become a true reflection of its community. One particularly meaningful change came from an unexpected source. The security company, facing pressure from other clients, announced a complete overhaul of their training procedures. They hired the university's diversity officer as a consultant and began requiring all their guards to complete the community-developed training program. The grocery store manager who had attended the first meeting implemented changes in his own store. He reorganized his international food section, consulting with community members to ensure products were properly labeled and respectfully displayed. He hired a more diverse staff and made sure his employees understood the importance of making every customer feel welcome. The young graphic designer's video of the incident had now been viewed hundreds of thousands of times online. But more importantly, her follow-up videos documenting the community's response had sparked similar initiatives in other cities. She received messages from people around the country asking how they could create similar programs in their own communities. During the second official community meeting, the elderly man who had witnessed the original incident shared an observation that resonated with everyone. "You know what's different now?" he asked. "It's not just that people are more aware or more careful. It's that people are more connected. We're not just customers anymore, we're neighbors looking out for each other." The doctor, listening to his words, reflected on how much had changed in less than 2 weeks. The humiliation she had felt that morning had been transformed into something powerful and positive. But she also knew that their work was far from over. As she sipped her coffee, still made exactly the way she liked it, she watched the diverse mix of people in the cafe. The elderly woman chatting with college students, the local business owners discussing plans with community activists, the high school students editing their documentary footage. The Sweet Bean Café had become more than just a coffee shop, it was now a model for what community could look like when people chose to stand together against injustice. 3 weeks after the incident, the Sweet Bean Café story had spread beyond the local community. A major news network picked up the story, not for the initial confrontation, but for what happened afterward. Their headline read, "How one café's response to racism created a blueprint for community change." The morning the news crew arrived, they found the young doctor in her usual spot, reviewing patient files while sipping her coffee. The cafe owner was teaching a new employee, a young man who had been inspired to apply after attending one of the community meetings. The elderly woman who had initially stayed away was now hosting a weekly knitting circle that had become unexpectedly diverse, with participants ranging from retired teachers to tech professionals looking for a screen-free hobby. But with increased attention came new challenges. The cafe owner received calls from business consultants offering to brand their inclusion initiative. Corporate chains reached out, wanting to implement similar programs but without understanding the grassroots nature of what made this movement special. "They want to turn this into a product," the owner confided to the doctor one morning. "But you can't package authentic community change like a franchise coffee blend." The doctor understood these concerns all too well. Her hospital had been recognized for its new inclusion protocols, and administrators from other healthcare facilities were constantly calling for advice. "It's not about copying a program," she would tell them. "It's about committing to the hard work of creating real change in your own community." The university employee who had developed the training program faced similar pressures. Corporate representatives offered to buy her materials, promising to scale them nationwide. Instead, she chose to share her resources freely with other communities who wanted to develop their own locally tailored programs. One rainy Tuesday morning, an unexpected visitor arrived at the cafe, the security guard from the incident. He had completed a comprehensive training program and wanted to apologize in person. The cafe fell silent when he entered, but the atmosphere was different from that first confrontation. This time, the silence carried the weight of potential redemption. The doctor wasn't there that morning, but the owner called her. When she arrived, still in her hospital scrubs, she found the guard sitting at a corner table, his hands wrapped around an untouched cup of coffee. Their conversation, while private, was witnessed by the regular customers who had supported her that first morning. "I've spent weeks thinking about what I did," the guard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was just doing my job, but I never stopped to question why I saw some people as suspicious and others as safe. The training opened my eyes, but it was watching this community's response that really changed me." The doctor listened carefully, neither dismissing his apology nor making it easy for him. Their conversation lasted over an hour, touching on personal experiences, ingrained biases, and the possibility of growth. By the end, they hadn't become friends, but they had demonstrated something powerful about dialogue and reconciliation. The high school students' documentary was finally complete. They premiered it at the cafe on a Sunday afternoon, with every seat filled and people standing along the walls. The film captured not just the incident and its aftermath, but the smaller, human moments that had made the change real: the elderly knitting circle welcoming new members, business owners rearranging their stores to be more inclusive, security guards engaging in thoughtful discussions about bias. The university expanded its program, offering free workshops to any community organization that wanted to participate. Local religious leaders, school administrators, and small business owners attended sessions together, breaking down barriers that had existed for years. The grocery store manager's changes had proved so successful that his corporate headquarters took notice. Instead of simply copying his initiatives, they invited him to lead a task force on community engagement, allowing other stores to develop their own locally appropriate programs. 1 month after the incident, the café hosted a community celebration. Not to mark the end of their journey, but to acknowledge how far they'd come and to reinforce their commitment to continuing the work. The tables were pushed together again, but this time they stretched out onto the sidewalk, creating one long community table. The doctor brought some of her pediatric patients and their families. The elderly knitting circle displayed a quilt they had made, each square representing a different community member's story. The high school students set up a booth to collect more interviews for their ongoing documentary project. A small stage had been set up near the café's entrance. Various community members took turns sharing their experiences and hopes for the future. The elderly man who had witnessed the original incident spoke about how the café reminded him of the civil rights movement's lunch counter sit-ins, and how change still required courage and community. The security guard who had apologized attended the celebration, now enrolled in a social work program at the local college. He stood quietly at the back, but his presence spoke volumes about the possibility of transformation. As the doctor looked around at the gathered crowd, the mix of ages, backgrounds, and experiences, she realized that what had happened that morning a month ago had created more than just a response to discrimination. It had awakened a community to its own potential for positive change. The café owner ended the celebration by unveiling a new permanent sign above the door. Below the café's name, it read, "Where every cup of coffee comes with a side of community." It wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise to continue the work they had started, one conversation, one cup of coffee, one changed mind at a time. 6 weeks after the incident, the Sweet Bean Café's influence had begun reaching into unexpected places. The city council announced plans to review its business licensing procedures, incorporating community engagement requirements. Local police departments reached out about implementing similar training programs. Even the Chamber of Commerce, traditionally conservative in its approach to social issues, began including diversity and inclusion metrics in its Business Excellence Awards. But success brought its own set of challenges. One morning, the doctor arrived to find the café owner in tears. A national coffee chain had opened across the street, marketing itself as the community's coffee shop and mimicking many of Sweet Bean's initiatives, but with corporate backing and slick advertising. "They're using our story to sell coffee," the owner said, her hands trembling as she wiped down the counter. "They've even copied our community board and training programs, but it's all surface level. There's no heart in it." The community's response was swift and unexpected. The elderly knitting circle, now a powerful force in local activism, organized a yarn bombing event, decorating the trees and benches around Sweet Bean Café with colorful knitted pieces bearing messages of authentic community support. Local artists created murals on neighboring buildings, telling the story of how real change happens from the ground up. The doctor's hospital had undergone its own transformation. The pediatric ward, where she spent most of her time, had become a model of inclusive healthcare. Parents from diverse backgrounds reported feeling more comfortable, more heard, and more involved in their children's care. Other departments took notice, and soon the entire hospital was implementing changes that went beyond simple training sessions. One morning, a young nurse pulled the doctor aside. "Remember that security guard from the café?" she asked. "His daughter was admitted last night with pneumonia." The doctor found herself treating the child of the man who had humiliated her weeks before. The guard, now a student of social work, recognized her immediately. Their interaction could have been tense, but instead became a powerful moment of healing. As they discussed his daughter's treatment, they also talked about how the incident had changed both their lives. "My daughter's going to grow up in a different world because of what happened that day," he said, watching his sleeping child. "A better one." The university's training program had evolved beyond simple workshops. They now offered a certificate in community engagement and social justice, with real-world practice at local businesses. The diversity officer who had spoken up that first day found herself teaching alongside business owners, community activists, and even the cafe owner herself. The high school student's documentary had taken on a life of its own. After being shared online, schools across the country began using it as a teaching tool. The students received invitations to speak at educational conferences, sharing their perspectives on how young people can drive community change. But not all changes were visible or celebrated. The grocery store manager noticed that some of his older customers stopped shopping there after he rearranged the international food section and hired a more diverse staff. The security company that had fired the guard lost several contracts with businesses that resisted the new training requirements. The cafe owner faced her own battles. Some suppliers, uncomfortable with her vocal stance on social issues, became unreliable. Anonymous online reviews tried to paint the cafe as anti-business or too political. But for every challenge, the community found creative solutions. Local farmers offered to supply the cafe directly. A tech-savvy regular customer helped create a website showcasing real reviews and community stories. The elderly knitting circle expanded their meetings to include business strategy sessions, proving that wisdom comes in many forms. One particularly meaningful development came from an unexpected source. The doctor's young patients, inspired by the cafe story, started a kindness club at their school. They created their own version of the community board, where students could share experiences and offer support to each other. The city's annual business award ceremony that year was different from any before. The Sweet Bean Cafe won not just the Business of the Year award, but a newly created Community Impact Award. In her acceptance speech, the owner shared the stage with dozens of community members who had been part of the change. "This isn't just about coffee," she said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. "It's about what happens when people choose to turn a moment of darkness into an opportunity for light. When they choose to do the hard work of real change instead of accepting easy answers." The doctor, sitting in the audience, thought about how much had changed in 6 weeks. The cafe had become more than just her morning coffee stop. It was a symbol of what communities could achieve when they refused to let injustice go unchallenged. That same week, a major civil rights organization contacted the cafe about documenting their story as a case study in community-led change. They were particularly interested in how the initiative had maintained its grassroots authenticity while creating lasting institutional change. The security guard, continuing his social work studies, began interning at a youth center. He used his experience to help young people understand how unconscious bias affects their actions and how to work toward positive change. His daughter, now recovered from pneumonia, often accompanied him to community events at the cafe. One quiet morning, as the doctor sipped her coffee and watched the diverse mix of customers flowing through the cafe, she noticed something remarkable. The interactions she witnessed weren't forced or self-conscious. They were naturally inclusive, genuinely warm, and authentically community-minded. A group of business students sat with elderly knitting circle members, learning about sustainable community business practices. The former security guard's daughter played chess with the cafe owner's mother. Local artists sketched plans for new murals while talking with city council members about public art initiatives. The corporate coffee shop across the street remained sleek and professional, but increasingly empty. As one customer put it, "You can't franchise authenticity. You can't mass-produce community. The Sweet Bean Café had proved that real change happens person by person, conversation by conversation, cup of coffee by cup of coffee. 2 months after the incident, the Sweet Bean Café story had inspired similar movements in communities across the country. A documentary filmmaker arrived to capture what she called the ripple effect of a single moment of courage. But the café's regulars knew that the real story wasn't in the dramatic moments, it was in the small, daily acts of change that had become part of their community's fabric. The doctor's morning routine now included arriving early to mentor a group of high school students interested in medicine. They gathered at what had become known as the Future Healers Table, discussing everything from medical school applications to healthcare inequality. Many of these students came from backgrounds traditionally underrepresented in medicine, and the doctor saw in them the change she hoped to see in her profession. One morning, a distinguished-looking woman in a business suit entered the café. She was the CEO of the security company that had fired the guard. Instead of sending representatives or lawyers, she had come herself to understand what made this community's approach to inclusion so successful. "We've implemented training programs in every city where we operate," she explained to the café owner. "But something's missing. The changes aren't sticking the way they have here." The owner smiled, gesturing to the busy café around them. "That's because you can't train people to care. You have to create spaces where caring becomes natural, where connection is valued more than convenience, where community isn't just a buzzword but a daily practice." The café had become a case study in authentic community transformation. Sociology students from the local university conducted research there, documenting how small changes in physical space and daily interactions could create lasting social change. They noted how the removal of the traditional counter barrier between staff and customers had changed the dynamics of service, how the community board had evolved into a hub of mutual support, how the mixing of different social groups had become organic rather than forced. The former security guard, now halfway through his social work program, had started a support group for other security professionals struggling with their role in perpetuating or challenging bias. They met weekly at the café, their conversations contributing to a growing understanding of how security could serve rather than intimidate communities. The Elderly Knitting Circle, which had become something of a local legend, received a grant to teach their community-building model to other organizations. They called their program Knitting Communities Together and traveled to senior centers around the state, showing how traditional activities could become vehicles for social change. But success also brought new challenges. As the café story spread, some began to question its authenticity. Social media critics claimed it was all a marketing ploy. Others suggested that the incident had been staged to gain attention. The community faced these accusations with characteristic grace and transparency. The high school students who had created the original documentary started a podcast series called Real Change, Real Stories, interviewing community members about their experiences before and after the incident. Their authentic, unscripted conversations provided a powerful counter-narrative to the skeptics. One episode featured the doctor and the former security guard's daughter, now recovered from pneumonia and a regular at the café's weekend children's reading circle. Their interaction demonstrated how personal connections could transcend past conflicts and create new possibilities for understanding. The café owner faced her own challenges. Other businesses began offering her money to consult on their diversity initiatives. Large corporations wanted to franchise her model. But she remained committed to the café's grassroots approach, choosing instead to mentor other small business owners who wanted to create authentic change in their own communities. The doctor's hospital had become a leader in community-centered healthcare. They removed the imposing security desk from their main entrance, replacing it with a welcome center staffed by community volunteers. Patient satisfaction scores rose, particularly among minority communities who had historically reported feeling unwelcome or discriminated against. The university's training program had evolved into a full-fledged center for community transformation, offering resources and support to organizations wanting to create similar changes. They emphasized that their model wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution, but rather a framework for communities to develop their own authentic approaches to inclusion. One morning, the café hosted a unique event, a story circle, where community members shared their experiences of change. The elderly man who had witnessed the original incident spoke about how the café reminded him of civil rights-era gathering places. A young woman described how the café's example had given her courage to challenge discrimination at her workplace. The former security guard shared how his daughter now wanted to become a doctor, like the kind one who treated me when I was sick. The corporate coffee shop across the street had closed, unable to compete with the authentic community connection that Sweet Bean offered. The space was being converted into a community center, with programs developed by local residents rather than corporate consultants. The doctor's young patients had expanded their kindness club into other schools, creating a network of student-led initiatives promoting inclusion and understanding. They organized regular field trips to the café, where the owner taught them about business ethics and community responsibility alongside barista skills. Local government officials began studying the café's impact on community relations. Crime rates in the area had dropped, business participation in community initiatives had increased, and surveys showed higher levels of trust between different social groups. But perhaps the most significant change was the most subtle. The café's morning rush no longer showed the unconscious segregation that was once common in public spaces. People naturally mixed and mingled, saving seats for elderly regulars, welcoming newcomers, sharing tables with strangers who became friends. The doctor, observing all this from her regular spot, realized that the café had become more than just a model of inclusion, it had become a prototype for a different kind of community, one where diversity wasn't just tolerated but celebrated, where inclusion wasn't a program but a way of life. As she finished her morning coffee, a new family entered the café, recent immigrants who looked uncertain and nervous. Before the staff could react, the elderly knitting circle members waved them over, pulling up chairs and offering to share their pastries. The family's tense expressions melted into smiles as they were absorbed into the café's warm atmosphere. This, the doctor thought, watching the scene unfold, this is what change looks like when it becomes real. Not in grand gestures or corporate initiatives, but in the small, daily acts of human connection that had become as natural as breathing in the Sweet Bean Café. 3 months after the incident, the Sweet Bean Café prepared to celebrate its 25th anniversary. What had once been planned as a simple celebration of a local business's longevity had evolved into something much more meaningful, a celebration of community transformation. The doctor arrived early that morning, just as the sun was rising. She remembered her first visit to the café, how she had chosen it simply because it was convenient to the hospital. Now, watching the owner arrange flowers and set up tables, she reflected on how a single moment of confrontation had catalyzed such profound change. The café's interior had evolved over the past months. Photos and artwork lined the walls, telling stories of community members and their connections. The community board had grown so large it now covered an entire wall, with sections for job opportunities, community resources, and personal celebrations. The Future Healers table, where the doctor mentored students, had inspired similar mentoring corners for other professions. The former security guard arrived with his daughter, now fully recovered and carrying a handmade card for the café's anniversary. He had completed his first semester of social work studies and was leading workshops on security reform at conferences across the state. His daughter proudly wore a toy stethoscope, inspired by the doctor who had treated her. The elderly knitting circle had prepared something special for the celebration, a massive quilt featuring scenes from the café's history. The central panel depicted the morning of the incident, but surrounding it were scenes of community coming together, of changes large and small, of moments of connection and growth. Local officials arrived, not for photo opportunities but as genuine participants in the community. The mayor, who had been skeptical of the movement at first, now regularly held coffee with community sessions at the café, implementing ideas gathered from these informal conversations into city policy. The university's Center for Community Transformation had documented the café's impact in unexpected ways. Crime rates in the neighborhood had dropped by 30%. Local businesses reported higher customer satisfaction and employee retention. The hospital's new inclusive practices had led to better health outcomes, particularly in historically underserved communities. The high school students who had created the original documentary were now graduating, but their legacy continued. They had trained younger students to maintain the Real Change, Real Stories podcast, ensuring that community voices would continue to be heard and preserved. During the celebration, the cafe owner unveiled a surprise, a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in community service, funded by a portion of the cafe's profits. The first recipient was a young barista who planned to study urban planning with a focus on creating inclusive community spaces. The corporate coffee chain that had tried to copy their success had learned valuable lessons. Instead of competing, they had partnered with the cafe to learn about authentic community engagement. Their CEO admitted publicly that real change couldn't be franchised, it had to grow organically from within each community. The doctor's pediatric patients had their own corner in the celebration. Their Kindness Club had spread to schools across the city, and they presented a video showing how children were leading change in their own ways. One young patient spoke about how seeing the doctor stand up to discrimination had inspired her to become a doctor herself. The elderly man who had witnessed the original incident stood up to speak, his voice stronger than ever. "I've seen movements come and go," he said, "but this is different. This isn't about slogans or programs. This is about people choosing, every day, to see each other as human beings worthy of respect and dignity." The security company's CEO returned, this time with news. They had completely restructured their training program, focusing on community engagement rather than confrontation. The guard who had caused the incident had unknowingly sparked a transformation in his industry, with other security firms following suit. As the celebration continued, new faces mixed with familiar ones. Tourists who had heard about the cafe came to learn from their example. Community leaders from other cities sought advice on creating similar changes in their own neighborhoods. But what impressed visitors most wasn't the programs or initiatives, it was the natural, unforced way people from all walks of life interacted. The doctor stepped up to the microphone, something she had been hesitant to do in the past. "3 months ago, I was humiliated in this cafe," she began. "But what happened next showed me something extraordinary about the power of community. We didn't just respond to an incident, we created a new way of being together." Looking around the room, she saw the impact of their work in countless small details. The way the former security guard's daughter played chess with elderly community members. How local business owners discussed plans with homeless shelter representatives. The natural mixing of languages, cultures, and generations. The cafe owner closed the celebration with a simple gesture. She hung a new sign above the door, created by local artists and crafted by community members. It read, "Sweet Bean Café, where every cup of coffee comes with a side of community." Below it, in smaller letters, EST 2000, Reborn 2025. As the celebration wound down, the doctor lingered over her coffee. She watched as the elderly knitting circle taught young tech workers how to knit, while those same young people helped the seniors set up social media accounts to share their stories. The former security guard's daughter practiced using her toy stethoscope. Unwilling volunteers, dreaming of her own future in medicine. The corporate consultants who had tried to package their success had missed the point entirely. The cafe's transformation couldn't be replicated through programs or policies alone. It was about creating space for authentic human connection, about choosing every day to see the humanity in each person who walked through the door. As the sun set on the celebration, the cafe glowed with warmth and possibility. The incident that had started their journey was now just one panel in a larger tapestry of community transformation. The real story wasn't about coffee, or even about discrimination, it was about what happens when people choose to turn a moment of darkness into an opportunity for lasting change. The doctor gathered her things to leave, but not before making plans for tomorrow morning's mentoring session. As she walked out, she passed new customers entering the cafe, drawn by the celebration. She smiled, knowing they would find more than just good coffee inside. They would find a community that had learned to transform pain into purpose, conflict into connection, and a single moment of courage into a lasting movement for change.